in Ethiopia. An expert dubbed TPLF as an existential threat to the Eastern African nation. Good evening to you all. Welcome to ETV News. I'm Grum Tariku. Now the news in detail. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed urged Ethiopians to play a pivotal role in pushing back and reversing distorted narratives. The Premier tweeted that Ethiopians must not forget that the country is engaged in a sophisticated narrative war against the nation. Despite many are using disinformation as a pathway for their sinister move, in unity we can write our own history, he underlined. Sometimes when history repeats itself, it gives opportunity for the betterment of a given development. But in the event that the TPLF nightmare of returning to federal power comes true, it would be disastrous and self-inflicting. Emeritus Professor of History at the Addis Ababa University, Baharu Zawde, said Ethiopians do not want a second edition of the so-called Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. Daniel Kasaun has more on this.
Many scholars of the Addis Ababa University have been critical opponents against ethnic-based and fascist style of ruling of TPLF clique, reflecting on the media bias and the erroneous analogy made between the 1991 and today's Ethiopia on News24.com. Emeritus Professor of the Addis Ababa University, Baharu Zawde, said Ethiopians don't want a second edition of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. When it comes to the nightmare of TPLF regaining power in Ethiopia by applying the same style, another scholar from the Addis Ababa University said it would be disastrous and self-inflicting.
The objective of the TPLF was dismantling the Ethiopian state by weakening the Ethiopian army. That was the main objective, because it lacks its dominance in the Ethiopian politics and the Ethiopian economic and other social affairs. So to return back for that dominance, it was trying to attack the Ethiopian army and the neighboring region.
Since the outbreak of the war in Tigray exactly a year ago, following the murderous attack against the Ethiopian Defense Force, was accompanied by a seizure of sophisticated weaponry of the command. Since then, the world has been inundated with misinformation and disinformation. It's largely thanks to the Ethiopian diaspora, most of it US-based, and a few foreign friends of Ethiopia, that the alternative voice has been heard in some measure.
There's a certain current of desperation in all of these, notes that say, oh, Abiy's finished, oh, it's over for the government, and Rashid Abdi just posted a tweet saying the TPLF ran a clean military campaign. Who is he kidding? I've been to my Kedra. My team and I interviewed the victims. We went to Desi. We heard more horror stories from IDPs. I have an internal UN email that implicates the TPLF in terms of forced recruitment. I have accounts from a source in terms of how the UN's own staff are getting beaten up and detained by the TPLF. A clean military campaign? Does anybody buy this?
Recently, a powerful voice has been added in the journalist Ermel Aragawi, an Ethiopian American of Tigray origin, who, totally disgusted by the brazen bias of mainstream media, took the courageous step of distancing herself from the Tigrayan network and began speaking the truth.
The U.S. is going with their old partner, right? TPLF was their partner for a very long time, from 91 to 2018. That was the group that led the coalition that ran the country. I'm sure there's a lot of personal relationships, a lot of financial gains that are made between partners, although I can't necessarily speak to specifics on that. But clearly there is an alliance, a beneficial alliance for those two groups.
The Professor Baro indicated that whichever way you look at it, the situation in which Ethiopia currently finds itself tragic in many respects. Tigray has been an integral part of Ethiopia, indeed a vital component of its culture and civilization.
የደርግ መሪ የነበሩት ኮሎኔል መንግስቱ እንዴት ካገር ወጡ የሚለው ጉዳይ በራሱም ቢጠና የዚሁ የማጭበርበር ውጤት አካል እንደሚሆን ጥርጣሬ የለኝም።
በዚህ ነው በእኛ ጊዜ ከጀርባ ያለፉ ያ ተይዟል ይሄ ተይዟል አዲስ አበባ ገብተናል ይያሉ ወደ ውስጥ ያለውን ሰራዊት ራሱ የማባባት አሁንም ለመጠቀም የሚሞክሩት ይሄንን ነው።
You are watching ETV News. A scholar says the practice and pattern of several Western media outlets regarding Ethiopia is very much a replay of similar campaigns meant as a pretext to military interventions. During an exclusive interview here today with EBC, a scholar of journalism, Samson Makonnen, underscored that most of the Western media outlets fail to exhibit even what is left of the principles of journalism. Goshu Melisau reports.
Recently, the so-called international media outlets have been spreading fake news and one-sided information regarding the one-year-old conflict in so much so that most of what they broadcast looks very much like TPLF's propaganda.
These medias.
In an exclusive interview with ETV, the scholar said these outlets first direct a campaign of misleading information and outright meddling, thereby paving the way for a military intervention at some point.
If you go to Afghanistan, if you think about Syria and Yemen, what they are doing in the first place is it's all about propaganda. It's about defamation, defaming certain country, defaming the ruling parties or heads of state. After such a defamation, the expected outcome is situating the field for military intervention, by the way. If you see the pattern critically, what they have been doing on Syria, in the first place, it is a very hard propagation of misinformation or disinformation. They propagate disinformations about maybe the ruling party or the leader. And then, after they create a negative information globally, the next step is military intervention, as has been actually the general of military base in Djibouti of USA.
In Ethiopia, concerns over disinformation, fake news and grievance politics is on the rise. The available evidence suggests that the strategic effects of disinformation are real in the Ethiopian case. While addressing the candid African platform, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta echoed the misleading aspects prevailing in those media outlets.
Sometimes, you watch news, which I've stopped watching, because, and you find Al Jazeera, CNN, Sky, BBC, whichever one you flip to. So they're talking about something that has happened in Rwanda, in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Somalia. My friends, sometimes even as far away as Nigeria on the other side of the continent. And then when the guy is signing off, this is John White reporting from Nairobi, Kenya. I like. So everybody now, when the thing that sticks in their mind, Nairobi, Kenya, is where Boko Haram lives.
Indeed, this should come as no surprise. The Western media is doing little to no investigative reporting. It doesn't even try to give a complete picture of the conflict.
Based upon those principles, For instance, in terms of accuracy and balancing, these media really failed to consider those issues. In the news that they have been producing regarding the law enforcement of the current the law enforcement practice in the northern Ethiopia, for instance, they really produce unbalanced information, which is fake. For instance, they took a communication officer of one party only by downplaying what is the perspective of the other party with regard to the issue.
Some Western media deliberately distorting facts while producing stories to secure their national interest, Samson added.
Any reports that has been made by those mainstream medias, West medias, is deliberate. They are deliberately missing stories. They are disinforming the audience deliberately. This is due to one critical reason, that's the issue of national interests of their respective countries.
The scholar urged the government to address up-to-date information to curb the misinformation.
Western media biases, coupled with TPLF's huge investment on propaganda, has proved a daunting challenge for Ethiopia in its effort to properly convey realities to the whole world. Young Ethiopians, especially from some of the ethno-national extremist groups, should also read history before naively supporting the TPLF, which is an existential threat to the Eastern African nation. The remark was made by the American democracy promotion expert and author David Steeman, and as well as renowned journalist Bob Schillhuber. We have more on this.
The American democracy promotion expert and author David Steinman has in-depth knowledge about Ethiopia, drawing on his service as a senior foreign advisor to Ethiopia's democracy movement for 27 years until its 2018 victory. He says the TPLF terrorist group is an existential threat to Ethiopia, and the younger generations should by no means support it.
I'm especially concerned about the Oromo supporters of the TPLF because I still remember how the TPLF used and abused the OLF back in the early days. And I really expect that if the TPLF ever gets back into power, it's going to do exactly the same thing again.
Steinman has also written a historical novel exposing the dictatorship and crimes against humanity by the TPLF over the past 3 decades.
My thinking was that by creating a work of entertainment, it would attract people to the subject matter who would not normally take an interest in Ethiopia. And in fact, if one looks at the reviews on Amazon that are posted by Westerners, it seems to be doing a very good job because they write about how they knew nothing about the situation in Ethiopia until they read the book. And basically the idea is they read the book, they enjoy the book, but by the time they're finished, they've learned a great deal about the TPLF's crimes against humanity.
Regarding the Western media distortions, which Ethiopia is grappling with, journalists say it all trickles down to the TPLF's huge investment in the media campaign.
Where then everybody is saying the same thing, the TPLF is good, the TPLF should be in negotiations, which is just not the truth. And unfortunately, the Ethiopian people, the vast majority of Ethiopians, have completely been silenced because of this investment by the TPLF over 10, 20, 30 years while they were in power. They've completely been able to shape the narrative. And unfortunately, again, because a lot of Americans don't know a lot about Ethiopia, we just believe what's in the news. And unfortunately, what's in the news is not the truth.
The other issues come from the irony of some Western reporters' coverage from another country, not even bothering to see the realities on the ground.
Southeast Washington, D.C., which is nearly 90% Black and is one of the poorest parts of the city, you have Washington Post reporters writing about what's taking place in Southeast Washington, D.C. without ever going to Southeast Washington, D.C. They refuse to drive 2 miles. They won't go 2 miles across the bridge to tell what's happening in these parts of our own city where they live. So it's not surprising they're not willing to go all the way to Addis Ababa to tell the truth. They're not willing to drive 2 miles. The Washington Post refuses, or the CNNs or the New York Times or AP, all of these outlets, they refuse to go and talk to the people that are impacted by violence, impacted by capitalism, impacted by our military. Even if it's right next door to them, even if it's 1 or 2 miles away, they will not go. And so we're seeing the same thing at an international level, that they're unwilling to go to Addis Ababa and they go to Kenya, to Nairobi instead.
So what Ethiopians should do is to pursue their greater political reforms, but in ways that are non-violent, mastering the stiffest resistance against TPLF, which is bringing the nation on the brink of destruction, it was pointed out.
2 explosions rocked Ugandan capital Kampala early on Tuesday, killing at least 3 civilians in what police described as a coordinated attack of extremists. 3 suicide bombers also died in the blasts, police said. Explosions caused chaos in Kampala as terrified residents fled the city center. ISIS claimed responsibility for the blasts in a statement on its Telegram channel. Meanwhile, a statement by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia said it has learned with dismay the death and injuries of civilians and police officers on November 16, 2021 of the twin terrorist attacks in Kampala. Ethiopia, the statement further said, condemns 3 cowardly attacks on the strongest terms while expressing solidarity with the people and government of the Republic of Uganda. The statement finally expressed deepest condolences to the people and government of Uganda, as well as the bereaved families. The Ethiopian government has reiterated commitment to work hand in hand with eligible aid organizations in enhancing delivery of emergency humanitarian assistance to people in need in several parts of the country. In a press briefing held today, State Minister of Government Communication Services, Kabeda Desisa, underlined that some aid organizations operating in Ethiopia are focused on their hidden political agenda rather than humanitarian assistance works they are interested with. Kabeda rejected the accusation from some international organizations that are complaining without a proof that the government caused blockade to northern parts of the country. These organizations are not willing to denounce atrocities being committed by the terrorist TPLF, he added. The government, Kabeda said, is thankful for Ethiopians for massively condemning foreign meddling.
Sidama Techula omwe Ada batemwe Techula omwe Ada batemwe Techula omwe Ada batemwe Techula omwe Ada batemwe Eshategesha Fire, 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 fire Sidama fire, Sidama fire Fire, 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 fire Sidama.
Came to Awasa to see 2 things, actually 3. And crocodiles, 3.
Not dangerous. Maybe if you want to get, you pass.
Ce mi-e frică că ne-au dat vestele astea, eu știu să not, dar nu știu să not lângă hipopotami. Pățim ce...
For the lake. This huge freshwater reservoir is a biosphere's paradise. Hippos, crocodiles, monkeys, and a lot of birds. You won't run out of things to photograph.
View. Let us show you how it looks like.
It's so beautiful, calm. We are sitting. Provide life jackets that Linda is showing towards me. Is it a life jacket or a weapon?
You are watching ETV News. The U.S. government usually uses exaggerated concerns over regional crises as a pretext to military intervention in countries which have stood against misguided policy. In a recent indication, U.S. Army General planning to use military solution to stop the war in Ethiopia, coupled with the integrated media campaign against Ethiopia, shows how the U.S. is running even more desperate in its attempt to justify the foreseeable intervention in Ethiopia. Habtamu Ashagri has more on this.
When the U.S. invaded Iraq, the then President George W. Bush had this to say to convince the world that the then Iraqi government was a threat to the stability of the world.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support.
He also pledged not to harm civilians in the operation.
I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm. A campaign on the harsh terrain of a nation as large as California could be longer and more difficult than some predict. And helping Iraqis achieve a united, stable, and free country will require our sustained commitment. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people.
Years after the invasion, Bush confessed his terrible mistake in Iraq, struggling with a lump in his throat.
This was not new for the U.S. It has been doing it all along in different nations, destroying infrastructures, social fabrics, killing civilians, and committing atrocities which it has never been accounted for. Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Serbia, Iraq, and other victims were manifestations of the U.S. policy to destroy nations under the guise of humanitarian concerns, democracy, and terrorism.
But this kind of flip-flopping attitude is not new to the U.S. The U.S. government has been doing it all along in different nations, destroying infrastructures, social fabrics, killing civilians, and committed atrocities which it has never been accounted for. Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Serbia, Iraq, and other victims were manifestations of the U.S. policy to destroy nations under the guise of humanitarian concerns, democracy, and terrorism. Former U.S. President Obama seriously ordered to take military action against Iraq and Syria, using fight against groups designated terrorists by the U.S. government as a pretext.
We went into Afghanistan out of necessity after our nation was attacked by al-Qaeda on September 11th, 2001. We went to war against al-Qaeda and its extremist allies with the strong support of the American people and their representatives in Congress, with the international community and our NATO allies, and with the Afghan people, who welcomed the opportunity of a life free from the dark tyranny of extremism.
But regarding the Afghan crisis, the Obama and Biden administrations have been taking contradictory stances.
We've also supported the Afghan people as they continue the hard work of building a democracy. We've extended more opportunities to their people, including women and girls. And we've helped train and equip their own security forces.
Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland.
The recent crisis in Ethiopia appears to be a very good opportunity for the US to press ahead with its legacy of destroying nations. Talking to the BBC last week, Major General William Dana, commander of Joint Task Force for the Horn of Africa, gave an indication that the US might use military operation to stop the war in Ethiopia. The justification behind the intervention is protecting the well-being of the entire region.
Anything that happens within Ethiopia is inextricably tied to the security, the safety of the rest of the region. When Ethiopia has an internal conflict that may make it decide to withdraw forces from Somalia, now you have 5 African Union countries that are also affected, and Somalia. You have the potential for violent extremist organizations to have greater activity there. So a primary role for our command here is to be able to respond to crisis, and in particular to respond to crises that are associated with U.S. diplomatic missions across Africa, but in particular in East Africa. We have done an incredible amount of planning and preparation to be able to respond, to assist in evacuation, to reinforce an embassy, to do a larger scale evacuation if necessary, both for U.S. personnel, U.S. citizens or dual citizens, or those from other countries. The East African Response Force, the only U.S. crisis response force that is located on the continent of Africa, is part of our command and located here. So we bring capabilities together from each of our joint services and allies and partners to any sort of crisis. And Ethiopia is obviously very concerning for us.
The truth, as history told us, turns out to be crippling governments that do not succumb to its hand-twisting approach. No historical moment proved that the US destroying peace and saved civilians from death in any country is intervened. The speech President Biden delivered while US troops withdrew from Afghanistan sums up the true color of US intervention. In all wrongdoings and mistakes made by the US administration, sovereign nations have demolished, thousands of civilians have been killed. No one brings them to face justice for all wrongdoings, as well as the killing of innocent civilians in Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria.
Add U.S. Special Forces, trainers, and some troops in Iraq and...
Renowned Kenyan Mumbai Saraki blames most Western media and the US government for meddling in the internal affairs of Ethiopia. Saraki underscored that Ethiopia is in a narrative war with vicious TPLF propaganda polluting the air. She called for adopting own narrative by Africans by way of staving off poisonous Western narratives. Kasaun Chani has more on this.
To all the dispossessed youth of Africa, for perpetuation of communion with ancestral spirits through the fight for African freedom.
Mumbai Saraki is a well-known Kenyan with a TV show that is one of Kenya's most highly rated online TV talk shows, with a huge following across sub-Saharan Africa and among Africans living in the diaspora. The programs are centered on Kenya's political landscape and current affairs. Saraki blamed most of the Western media and the United States government for meddling over Ethiopia's internal affairs. She said she was presenting Ethiopia's issues since 2019, noting the source for all of these conflict situations in Ethiopia is linked with the Nile underground Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
You know, Babylon is calling the civil war in Ethiopia, but it's more of an invasion, beloveds. And who has invaded Ethiopia? That's what it looks like. And, you know, a lot of people are asking why I'm silent on this, but I've been talking about this since 2019. All of this is linked to the Nile and the Grand Renaissance Dam that, you know, that Ethiopia created. And Egypt, remember when Egypt went running, Sisi went running to Trump and was like, you know, we need to stop Ethiopia. And there's been so many, you know, the African Union tried to intervene, the United Nations tried to intervene, Washington tried to intervene, where they all went. The prime minister didn't go of Ethiopia, though, but they all went there. And then Trump released a statement where he was like, you know, Egypt could bomb the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. And there was this whole messaging, beloveds. That's when the war started. The war is what we're seeing happening right now in Ethiopia is what is trying to manifest physically, but the Ethiopians are standing firm, beloveds.
Saraki pointed out that Ethiopia is in an innovative war as facts are being twisted by the coalition of the so-called United States experts and their TPLF stooges.
Ethiopia is in a narrative war. Basically, it's the propaganda of the West that is pushing what is happening in Ethiopia. And it's because we don't have our own narrative. I've seen so many different angles to this, where Ethiopians were saying that they saw some Muzungus fighting amongst the rebels. And you just saw a clip, beloveds, of the CNN presenter confronting the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's spokeswoman. Awesome, powerful African woman, you know, so composed. I'll leave a bit of, I don't know how much of the clip we were able to share, but I'll leave the link where you can watch the full clip. But you can see how aggressive they are with their propaganda. Like, it's shameless at this point. Because all gloves are off at this point. This is how they invaded Iraq, beloveds. Weapons of mass destruction.
She pinpointed that this is what they did to Libya as well. As an extension of this debacle, the United States wants to repeat show in Ethiopia, calling on Africans to stand in unison. She further appreciated the only reason that Ethiopia has been standing for so long alongside Earth's diaspora and Earth's very powerful. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out.
You are watching ETV News, and finally, Libya has rejected rumors circulating that it has closed its embassy in Addis Ababa. The embassy has issued a formal report to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that the Chancery in Addis Ababa is still open and delivering services. The information circulating is totally false and groundless, stated the embassy. Recently, some media and organizations are spreading fake news that countries are closing their embassies in Addis Ababa. This fake news is part of the ongoing foreign pressure on Ethiopia. Now, a reminder of the headlines once again. Scholar says Western media do not give complete picture of situation in Ethiopia. An expert dubbed TPLF as an existential threat to Eastern African nation.